The following account occurred a few years ago. It has always been difficult for me to talk about, but I have found writing about it to be therapeutic. I was 17 at the time and had just gotten my first job. I lived in rural Western Virginia in a small mountain community. My mom's friend owned a camping resort not far from my house that had a general store, and she said she'd pay me to help out in the store during the busy months in the summer. It was a pretty easy job, and I met a lot of out-of-towners, which was nice because our community could get so isolated. Most of us lived pretty far away from each other. One day, a big, burly mountain man type came into the store. He was in his late 40s, early 50s, probably 6'5", and about 280 pounds. He looked dirty, like he worked outside a lot. His clothes were sort of tattered and he had a long beard. We had a few of the woodsy hermit types in the area, and he definitely looked like one of them. He bought some basic items, one of which was one of our homemade bars of soap. When he came to the register, he looked me up and down carefully. He didn't talk for a minute, just stared. His people skills clearly needed work.
Did you make this soap?
He asked gruffly. Possibly, I said. I help out with that sometimes.
You make a lot of your own stuff?
Toiletries and things like that, yeah.
I like that,
he said, nodding to himself. I honestly did not know how to respond. I quickly rang up his items and he paid with crumpled money. Right before he left, he asked,
You cook too?
Sometimes, I replied.
Bet the boys around here are itching to marry you,
he said as he smiled to himself. I said nothing. I was puzzled as to what I said that stood out as wife material. I told Krista, my mom's friend and my boss, about the bizarre encounter, and she laughed it off. So did my friends and family. But then Mountain Man started turning up more often. We chatted a little bit here and there, and I found out he had a cabin in the woods he claimed he built with his bare hands. He said he hunted and lived off the land, other than the things that he bought at the store. Over time, our chatter escalated, with him making comments about how nice it would be to have a woman like me around, who could make those things and cook his kills. One time he even said I had the
birth and hips that men lust after.
It made me shudder. He even started inviting me to fish with him, hunt with him, see his place, etc. And I always politely declined. But he got more and more insistent. And I told Krista about how uncomfortable he was starting to make me. The intensity with which he said those things really scared me. She said that when he came in, go get her and she would ring him up. Thanks to her, I started speaking to him less and less, and I thought I wouldn't have to deal with him anymore. But one night, I was closing up, and it was late, around 10 at night. Krista had left about an hour before, and I was leaving by myself. The only two cars in front of the store were an old blue pickup and mine. I was immediately alarmed, because I knew Mountain Man drove a blue pickup. But I didn't see him in the lot, just his car. So I walked quickly over to my car and checked the back seat before I started her up. But then when I first turned the key in the ignition, I got nothing but sputters. I tried several more times and quickly got scared. Of all nights, why is this happening tonight? I remember asking myself angrily. Just as I was reaching for my phone to call for help, there was a loud pounding on the driver's side window. I'm shocked that I didn't piss myself. I didn't even want to look, because I knew it was him, but I did. And my suspicions were confirmed. He smiled a big grin at me, showing me exactly which teeth were missing.
Need some help?
He said loudly through the window. I shook my head furiously. My dad is on his way. I hadn't spoken to my dad in years. Mountain Man laughed.
No, he's not. Open the door.
The hairs on my neck stood up straight. How did he know I was bluffing? No, I said firmly. Leave me alone. Suddenly, he looked angry. He pulled the handle, but I had locked all the doors when I first got in. He kept furiously pulling the handle and started pounding on the window. "Leave now or I'm calling the cops!" I screamed at him. He clearly wasn't getting the message, so I pulled out my phone and called 911. I must have sounded hysterical to the dispatcher, and I knew she could hear him pounding. She said she would have officers out ASAP, but out here, that could be a while. "The cops are on their way. Leave now!" I screamed at him, but it didn't seem to deter him. But after a few more minutes of pounding, he suddenly stopped and walked back to his truck. I watched him go, hopeful he would just leave me alone. But then he started walking back towards me with a crowbar in his hand. "No!" I screamed at him. "Get away from me!" He started swinging at the driver's side window with the crowbar. I ducked down into the passenger seat on the floor and covered the back of my neck like they teach you in a tornado drill. I heard the sickening crack of the window, but not for long. Suddenly, I heard male voices shouting, telling Mountain Man to get away from the car. I sat up and saw two men approaching, one with a shotgun pointed at Mountain Man. I recognized them as a couple of guests staying at the resort for a camping trip. I breathed a sigh of relief and got out of the car, telling them that the police were on the way. I thanked them profusely as we waited for the police, and surprisingly, Mountain Man didn't make any moves to get away. But the cops came pretty quickly after that, so he didn't have much of a chance. They took him away, and I gave them my statement. I was pretty shaken up for a while afterwards. A few weeks later, I finally got the scoop on the man. Apparently, he had a history of mental illness. He had been in and out of state institutions. He really had been living in an old cabin in the woods where he wasn't taking his meds, and his issues were only getting worse. My cousin Luke is a cop, and later told me some more about the case that he had heard through some other officers. The police did a search of the cabin after the incident to see if there was anything that might be of interest to them. Apparently, in it he said he was lonely and wanted a wife. He mentioned me by name a lot. Stupid name tag. And Luke said there were a lot of lewd things in there about me that he didn't want to share, but tried to put it simply by saying the Mountain Man had detailed a plan to abduct me, starting with sabotaging my car engine to get me into a vulnerable position. When Luke said that, I nearly burst into tears, thinking about how horribly that night could have gone if those two men hadn't come along. Thankfully, he has been put back into a state institution. With any luck, he'll stay there for good.
"10 years ago, I was returning home from a road trip with two friends. I got a phone call from my parents asking when we would be arriving, and I explained that we were about 25 minutes away. About a minute later, we came around a bend. It was a full moon, and we could see the reflection from a lake below us, and other than that, the road was completely empty. Suddenly, everything went completely dark in the car. No lights from the dash or gauges, or headlights on the road. The music also stopped and restarted at the beginning of the CD we were listening to. There was now a vehicle pulled over by the police about a quarter mile in front of us that hadn't been there a split second before. I assumed I had dozed off for just a second, as it was late. I thought it was still quite peculiar, though. After about a minute, the driver of the car turned the music all the way down and said, "Did that just happen to anyone else?" The other passenger in the back seat sat forward abruptly and exclaimed, "I thought I just fell asleep." We then realized that the clock in the car was reading an hour later than it just had a minute before. To keep ourselves from freaking out, we decided that the car had probably had a momentary electrical failure and reset the clock to an odd time, turned off the dash lights, headlights, and gauges, and restarted the CD player. But when we arrived home, 25 minutes later, we were an hour late. I am missing an hour of my life, and to this day have no idea how it happened. I've got a good one. I'm not usually one that believes in the paranormal, but this made me question everything. My girlfriend had always told me her house was haunted. I'd always hear creaks and stuff upstairs, and the occasional footstep, but I always played it off as normal house noises. Until one night in August of this year. We were downstairs watching TV like usual, about to go to bed when we both got a very weird feeling almost simultaneously. She gave me a weird look, but I didn't think anything of it. So we went to bed. After a few minutes of her on Twitter and me on Reddit, we put our phones down and roll over to go to sleep. Then we both heard the words,
"Good night."
in a child's voice. Doesn't seem too strange, right? Well, considering there weren't children in the house, we both looked at each other like, why would you say goodnight like that? Then we realized neither of us had said it, and we left her room fairly quickly. We went downstairs to lie on the couch and watch a little TV and come to our senses and figure out where those words could have come from. Then we both got that someone's watching you feeling. Not like, oh, that dude over there has been staring at me, but a something will not take their eyes off me no matter what I do feeling. So we decided it best to leave the house. We went to walk out the front door, but right as we were about to open it, we heard the child's voice again. This time, it came from the balcony right above us in the entryway. Clear as day, a child said,
"Mommy and Daddy."
We looked at each other. I may or may not have screamed. And we ran to my car and decided to drive to the one place that was open in our shitty small Oregon town, Walmart. The problem was, as soon as we got in the car, we knew something had come with us. And it was pissed at us for leaving. The second we got into my Honda, there was nothing but the feeling of hate instilled into both of us for no reason whatsoever. Whatever it was, filled that car with hate. It's now about 4 a.m., and I have to be at work in 5 hours, so we decide to go back to her house and try to get some sleep and see what happens. We walk in the front door, and nothing but quiet. We walk up the stairs, turn right, and suddenly it sounds like a dog is growling from her upstairs bathroom. It takes me a second though, because I grew up with dogs, and all I could think was that it was just mine in there being weird. 5 seconds later, I realize I'm at her house and no dog has ever set paw in there. Something was fucking growling at me and I had no idea what. At this point, I'm fucking pissed at whatever is happening because I'm tired and need to sleep for work. So I come up with this brilliant plan of talking shit to whatever's causing all these problems. The only thing that sticks out at this point is me yelling, "If you're so pissed, do something about it." Right after that, I feel something pull my shirt. I turn around thinking my girlfriend is playing a very unfunny joke on me. But no, she was still downstairs. Something pulled my shirt. After that, I decided it was time to leave for the night. At 6 a.m., we get in my car and drive to my mom's house. That car ride was much less hate-filled and all the bad feelings were gone for a while. I went to work while my girlfriend slept at my mom's place, and when I got off, we went back to her house to check things. Everything seemed fine, except for the one picture of us she had hanging on her wall was knocked to the ground like something out of a fucking horror movie. But she was too exhausted to care about my safety at that point, and I was so tired I was willing to let whatever was there kill me just so I could get some rest. 2 weeks later, we moved out and haven't had any problems since. I never believed in the paranormal at all until this happened. I still question it. My brain thinks there has to be a logical explanation to all of it, and I'm sure there is. But I know she believes, and a piece of me believes, that there is something else in that house.
Back in 2007, shortly after my 15th birthday, my mom was out of town for a few days on a business trip. My mom and I lived alone in a small house in a neighborhood that was on the sketchier end of decent, and that fact, combined with her paranoia about me being home alone longer than 4 or 5 hours, meant that I had to stay over at a friend's house while she was gone. This friend's house was across the street and one house over from my own. The place my mom was going was only about 2 hours away, and I'd gotten a bug up my ass about being treated like the young woman that everyone kept calling me. So for the week leading up to the trip, I was moaning and groaning about being old enough to take care of myself and insisting that I could just check in with my friend's parents every now and then. But in truth, my house was pretty creepy at night even when my mom was there. And I found out the day my mom was scheduled to leave that my friend had somehow gotten her hands on a PlayStation 3. So it didn't take me long to get over being unfairly babysat. At around 11 on the last night I was there, we ended up back at my friend's room, screwing around with a brand new flip phone I'd gotten for my birthday. Her parents had gone out hours earlier after buying us pizza for dinner, and probably weren't going to be back for at least an hour. And we'd gotten bored downstairs with her one PS3 game that we'd been playing for days already. It was too late to call any of our friends, but I knew my mom was coming home tomorrow morning at some ungodly hour, and I knew she had this thing about her answering machine. No matter how tired she was, no matter where she'd gotten back from, if there were any messages on the answering machine, she'd listen to all of them. Being the bored 15-year-olds we were, my friend and I decided to leave a message or two for my mom to find in the morning. We called my home phone and put it on speaker, cracking up and trying to figure out what our message was going to be. It normally took 5 rings for a call to go to the machine, but on the 3rd ring, the phone picks up and we hear,
Hello?
The voice sounded like it belonged to some 60-year-old guy who'd been smoking for the last 40 years of his life. But even past that, there was this menace to his voice. I can't describe it exactly, but it sounded very cold and very dangerous. The sort of voice where if you heard it on the street, you'd want to get away from that person immediately. I looked at my friend. Her eyes were huge, and her face was completely pale, and I'm sure I didn't look any better. Neither of us could get it together to say anything in response.
Hello?
He said again. There was a pause, and I tried to squeak out something along the lines of, "Who the hell are you and why are you in my house?" But then he said in a very low voice,
You shouldn't have called.
There was some sort of slam. I immediately dropped my phone and proceeded to freak out, as did my friend. She asked me if I knew who that was, and I said no. Of course I didn't know the creepy guy answering my phone at 11 at night. We were so shaken up that we couldn't immediately figure out who we should call or what we should do. If we should call the cops or call my mom or call my friend's parents or run around making sure all the doors and windows were locked. So we ended up sprinting around my friend's house, double-checking every lock we could check while gasping out what happened to my friend's parents on the phone. They were about 15 minutes away and said they'd call 911. And her mother told us to stay in my friend's room with the door locked and all the lights on in case this guy was going from house to house. So for 10 minutes, we were huddled in the far corner of my friend's room, basically under her bed, jumping every time the house settled, or one of our legs scraped on the carpet. You can imagine how freaked out we were when her parents rushed in and started rattling at her bedroom door. forgetting that it was locked on their orders. The cops got to my house not too long after her parents got home. To be honest, I don't really remember a lot of the specifics about what the cops were doing, mainly because I refused to set foot outside of the house. But I remember that they asked my friend and I a lot of questions. We couldn't really give them a lot of information, unfortunately. We had called from my friend's room, which was in the back of her house, away from where we would have been able to see my house. And dude with a creepy smoker's voice isn't a very helpful description to go off of when looking for someone. One question they asked sticks out though, because I remember thinking it was weird for them to ask who had keys to get into the house. I told them only my mom and I had keys. I found out later that the reason the police asked was because there was no sign of forced entry anywhere around the house, and that the front door was wide open when they got there. There wasn't really anything messed up and nothing was taken, but our wall-mounted corded phone was hanging off the hook, and the phone base itself was cracked like it had been smashed with something. Both my mom's room and my room had also had some stuff moved around and displaced, like someone was going through our drawers and the stuff in our rooms. My mom got called at some point during all of this and managed to get home that night, very tired and very freaked out about what had happened. The cops investigated the incident but never came up with any answers. We weren't doing too well financially at that point, but we still managed to move across town within a few months of this happening. For the months between that night and the day we moved, though, I couldn't sleep and had really bad nightmares. I also flat out refused to be alone in the house, even for a couple minutes, and started getting really obsessive about checking and double checking locks, a habit which has stuck around since this happened. And now that I've written all this out, I remember that there's one thing I haven't told anyone about all this, mostly because at the time, I thought that the whole thing might get blamed on me if I said anything. Earlier that day, I'd gone back over to my house to get a notebook of mine full of writing I wanted to show my friend. Nothing was obviously wrong as far as I could tell. The front door was locked when I got to it, no signs of tampering with it, or any weirdness by the door. No noises from any part of the house. But the minute I stepped inside, something just felt off. Really off. It was really, really quiet. I was getting chills up and down my spine, and I had goosebumps all over. I tried to will myself to just get over it, to go back into my room to get the notebook, but I couldn't make myself take more than a few steps into the house. I was too creeped out. I locked the door, and I ran back across the street. When I got back to my friend's house, I felt like an idiot. Of course. Was I really such a wimp that I couldn't walk through my own house when it was empty? But looking back, well, who knows? Maybe my gut was right about something just not being right. Freaks me out even thinking about it, what could have happened if I'd ignored it and walked further inside. I've thought back on that moment a lot too, wondering if maybe I left the door open when I left, but there's no way. I distinctly remember locking the deadlock and looking over my shoulder the whole time because I had that burning, crawling feeling you get when you're being watched. And after the creepy call, I checked, and I had my keys in my backpack. So random home intruder with a creepy voice and a very mysterious, probably very messed up motive for breaking into my house. Let's not meet. Ever again.